If you're going to make it as an artist, you have to get good at being uncomfortable in so many ways. If somebody doesn't like it, that's fine. It doesn't mean that the piece does not have merit. It delights me in equal measure to think of the work as something that doesn't belong to me anymore.
Welcome to the StageLync podcast, your access and connection to the live performing arts. In this podcast, you'll hear from some of the industry's most inspiring people from around the globe who create magic on stage and backstage. Our guests share their knowledge, passion, and the real stories of how a show comes together. We hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the StageLync podcast. Today we're talking with Ess Hödlmoser. Ess is a Canadian performance artist and author. Ess's award-winning circus acts have been shared on international stages like the 40th and the 44th Festival Mondial Cirque de Demain, France's Got Talent, the Moulin Rouge, and more. Copies of Ess's two coffee table books, Slow Circus, BARBETTE, and Slow Circus Vacuum, and growing zine catalogue can be found on bookshelves and libraries in every corner of the globe, even Antarctica. Ess is found on socials at Strange Wonderful Creature. You have to go check him out because he's really cool. Ess, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit, before we get into your work and stuff now, about how you evolved to be where you are today, a writer and a performance artist.
Oh, geez. I think I've always been a writer. I can remember dutifully plagiarizing my favorite fantasy novels as a kid in my 8x11 workbook and being like, it's fine. I'm practicing plot construction or something. I'm sure it's in a Tupperware somewhere in my mother's attic still. I've always written. And once I got past the I am a child plagiarizing my favorite book stage, that shifted more into wanting to document the world that I was seeing around me. And it's a habit that I've never quite shaken. I took that over to my circus adventures pretty early on as a way to remember it, as a way to make sense of what I was seeing, as a way to document it. I got pretty obsessed with wanting to make sure there was more of that in the circus world as well. And it's something I'm still doing today. Circus itself was a surprise for me. I don't think that anyone in my family, including myself, thought that would be where I end up, but here we are. We love a plot twist.
And so what was your journey into that circus? I mean, you just sort of indicated that your family wasn't in the circus. There was no history of people being in the circus, no?
No. My father was a military pilot and my mother was a nurse, now librarian. My family is, I would say, a family of scientists. My sisters are biologists or chemical engineers. My grandfather was a nuclear physicist or astrophysicist. He's going to kill me for mixing that up. But anyways, science, hard sciences. And I was like, cool, I'm going to go play violin, which I did for a little bit. But the short version of how I got into circus would be, I was in my undergraduate degree. I did start 1 year of a fine arts degree at York University in classical violin. I passed my exams to get into my second year. And I ended up going downtown to the University of Toronto St. George campus to listen to a free lecture from a professor being given. A friend of mine was in this professor's program and was like, you have to come hear this guy talk. And I was like, okay. I went down and it was one of those like a big comet crashing through the proverbial sky moments where I'm like, I have to study whatever the heck this is. And that turned out to be disability studies. Although honestly, it felt like getting to dig into the construction of how we decide or make up or rework what we deem to be normal or not, which is something I was obsessed with from a pretty early age. So I was delighted to find that there was a whole classroom of people studying the same thing under a bunch of different umbrellas. So from a philosophy perspective, anthropology perspective, historical perspective, legal perspective, and so on and so forth. I did finish that degree. And in the midst of it, I ended up getting really into Muay Thai, Thai kickboxing. I was a band geek growing up, as the violin starter package might have indicated in terms of my post-secondary education. But I never really managed to get into competitive athletics until that point. So I would have been late teens, early 20s. I got pretty carried away with it, which has been a theme in my life when I find something that I like a lot. And unfortunately for me, I was doing quite well. I was a North American champion in 2013. I'd gone semi-pro and my plan was to graduate with my bachelor's degree in a couple of months and to go to Thailand so that I could go pro. Because in Thailand, you can have hundreds of fights every year. And in North America, that was a bit of a harder thing to do. At the time, I don't think it was even legal to have fights in Canada. We had to go to the States for our fights.
Wow.
But I liked it. I was like, okay, this is what I do now. And I was getting ready for a semi-pro bout, and I got very badly injured in training. I ended up with an acquired brain injury. My brain was bleeding, and it took about a year to fully recover. I was in a neuropsych rehab program with the University of Toronto's concussion clinic, the McLean Sport Clinic there, which is wonderful. I was very fortunate to qualify for that care because I was still an undergraduate student. But there was a few months where I suddenly couldn't read and suddenly couldn't speak more than a couple of sentences without complete exhaustion and needing to sleep for hours. It was a real reworking of my sense of self, which had been very much constructed around academia, reading, writing, and of course, athletics. My fighting career was over. Getting kicked in the head was no longer an option if I wished to continue in a capacity that might involve living independently as I grew older. So that was that. I had the big usual, I've lost my identity as an athlete, what do I do now moment? And my former sparring partner, a wonderful German woman by the name of Jana Hein, I'll give you the spelling for it after. She was a North American champion the same year as me. She became a world champion actually as well. And after I was cleared by my doctors to go back to anything beyond like a brisk walk to the corner, she dragged me out to the Toronto School of Circus Arts, which sadly just closed this past summer, closed its doors in August. And she took me to a silks class, which I hated with a burning passion. I hated it so much. But I remember, I had gone from training like 40 hours a week as a member of the fight team at my club. And I had tried, some rec yoga classes, some rec dance classes. I was like, just kill me. This is not it's not enough. I don't know what I need, but this isn't it. And TSCA had tried a preparatory program that year. And you could train 20 hours a week plus more at open gym if you wanted. And I was like, okay, I'll do that for a year. Whatever. I just need to do something. And one thing followed the next. I think I saw a photo of a contortionist for the first time. And the getting carried away with it started there.
That's an amazing story. It's so fascinating. That is not a linear path into circus by any means. And then the fact that I got my head, you went from Muay Thai to contortion. Nobody would have done that. Like, there's nobody on the planet would have been pro Muay Thai, and then become a contortionist. That's just awesome.
Yeah, 100% less kicking and punching people in the face. But I would say the biggest adjustment going from semi-professional kickboxing to circus arts was a psychological shift that I didn't think I would have to do. I did have to keep doing silks, regrettably, in that preparatory program. It was part of the general foundation. I gritted my teeth through every class. Eventually, I was strong enough to get to the top, and TSCA was in an old airplane hangar. So they had a high bay that was it was 40 feet high. So what are we looking at? 12 meters, 14 meters, something like that. And in Muay Thai, you push yourself until you literally are ready to throw up, and then you push yourself some more. If you don't do that, then you might not win your fight. And if you do that consistently and you just find new levels of making yourself uncomfortable, you might go really far with a little bit of luck as well. And I learned the hard way that pushing yourself to the point of complete physical exhaustion up to the top of a 40-foot silk and saving nothing to come down is not the attitude to bring to circus training.
You didn't fall, did you?
No, I did not fall. But from the outset, I was like, okay, I know that I'm tough. I know that I'm disciplined. This is going to be fine. I'll just translate that right into circus. No, I feel like it's been a lot about finding the sweet spot in order to have a circus career late, air quotes, late in life, to be a contortionist, air quotes, late in life, and then to transition careers. I wanted to say completely, I don't know if that's accurate or not, to aerial straps. Another non-complementary shift, because I don't do contortion straps or loop straps. I don't know what you want to call it. I do straps. Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting. So with both of those disciplines, you still practice both of them today?
Yes, although the ratio of how much time I spend on one or the other has changed quite a lot. About 5 years ago, when I was contortion focused, I would do straps a couple times a week. I loved it. I was terrible at it. My noodly little contortion body couldn't do anything. Contortion training was 5 or 6 days a week, about 4 hours a day kind of thing. In the last several years, because I had a very big goal, I wanted to try to get back to Cirque de Demain with an aerial strap solo. I shifted my focus entirely to that. So I did what I would call maintenance training. Having been a professional contortionist, it feels wrong to say that I'm still one now. You know, I look at my peers who have continued within that discipline and I'm like, I can't do that shit anymore. I can't sit up. This body, I don't sit on my own head anymore. So I feel like I've lost my contortion
to the muscles
card.
that you need for straps, right? So
Yeah. You know what? There are, not for everybody. With contortion, there's so many factors that are unique to each artist's body that make you excel at certain positions and find other ones quite challenging. There's always the conversation about genetic predispositions, it's true, but things like your limb length ratios will change not only what a trick or a shape looks like on you compared to the person next to you, but also how easy it is for you or how difficult and so on. I know Rachel Berenger, I think, is like one of the best examples. She lives in Boston, of somebody who does like contortion, like really bendy contortion, and is such a beast on straps. My body does not feel good when I pursue contortion to the volume that I used to perform it at and try to do the kind of explosive or dynamic straps vocabulary that I've learned.
Right.
But that's not true of everybody. There's certainly exceptions to the rule in both directions.
Yeah.
And I think the best thing is just not attaching value about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to it.
There's also the concept of there's the capability of doing either of those disciplines and then the artistry behind it, right? Because it's an expression of what you're trying to say or do or show or perform. Which kind of leads me to the question, when you performed in Cirque de Demain, last year, right? The 44th one that you were in?
Just this past January, yeah.
Oh, just this past January.
The last edition, yeah.
Yeah, and you did a straps number?
I did a strap solo called BARBETTE.
And tell us about that. So tell us about the evolution of that act.
Oh, God. The act that nearly killed me. I started BARBETTE. BARBETTE started off as a really bad contortion solo maybe 4.5 years ago.
It changed to a straps act.
I always wanted it to be a straps act, but I didn't have... It was I think it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I didn't have access to aerial space. And I was like, okay, I'll work out these ideas with what I can do in the space that I have, which was contortion. I had come across an old Circus book that had mention of BARBETTE in it around that time. Like all of us at the beginning of the pandemic, I was on my computer too much, and I had found these circus auctions. You can find these absolutely wild estate sales and circus auctions in like Florida, like Sarasota area, or Wisconsin in the Baraboo area from circophiles who are getting rid of their collections or who have inherited collections from family members who have passed away, and they don't want all of this circus ephemera, and it goes up in big lots for auction. And I put a bid in on a box of circus books. I got it for dirt cheap. And this giant box of circus books showed up at my house. And I opened up one of them and came across the story of BARBETTE. I'd never heard about this person before. BARBETTE's real name was Vander Clive Broadway. And he was born in the very late 1800s in or near Round Rock, Texas, in the United States. And BARBETTE became a circus artist. Started off with wire walking, apparently learning on his mother's clothesline in his mom's backyard, before joining an aerial group act with two other women, where the third woman had passed away, been injured, whatever the case was. And they asked Vander Clive Broadway if he wanted to join the troupe, but he'd have to not mind dressing up as a woman. And he was like, yeah, no problem. And one thing led to the other. And BARBETTE ended up developing this female impersonation act that became a massive sensation in Europe, was one of the highest paid acrobats in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. And headlined at the Casino de Paris and the Moulin Rouge and the Wintergarten in Berlin, like was just a huge celebrity. BARBETTE would come out in these massive, opulent couture gowns. Everybody wanted to dress Barbette and do like a little bit of a striptease on a couch or something before doing some wire work, and then some trapeze work and some rings work, slowly losing pieces of costume as the number went along. And at the very end, when everyone was very convinced they'd been watching an absolutely beautiful woman the entire time, Barbette would remove his wig and try to just blow up this beautiful impression he'd made by like flexing his muscles and pretending to swing a golf club while everyone was delighted or scandalized or both.
I love that.
Yeah, Barbette did that for quite some time, until about the mid-1930s. Barbette did have some injuries that necessitated partial retirement or changes in career, but I remember reading about this stage of Barbette's career and being struck by the political similarities of the time as well. So in the mid-1930s, there was a couple incidents with Barbette where he was arrested and banned from returning to certain venues because he'd been caught with other men. And even though Barbette had this very gender-bendy act that people loved, it was not a time that was welcoming or accepting of homosexuality, queerness, cross-dressing, any of this stuff. So I was like, okay, mid-1930s when Barbette was like a huge star in Germany and France and things like that, like those producers wouldn't be able to book Barbette as this sweep towards right-wing politics would have been moving across Europe, which is what we're seeing right now in the United States. 4 years ago when I started this project, I'm like, I wonder how people would feel about this same story, the same act narrative, if we were to explore it 100 years later. You know, Barbette was just starting to peak in celebrity around 1924, 1925. And I was like, wow, if I was able to make a straps act that was good enough for this, because in my mind, you can have the balances and the swings that mimicked the same kind of movements that Barbette did. I was like, I'm not going to get good at 3 different disciplines in time before my joints give out, but I could probably do one. And I think straps would check all these boxes. I was like, okay, yeah. I was early on in my transition as well. And I was like, okay, yeah, how do people feel about this? We have different cultural touch points for quote unquote female impersonation, which is what it would have been called when Barbette was doing it. I think a lot of people are very familiar with RuPaul's Drag Race and drag as an art form now, but we can't say that's what Barbette was doing. We can't paint historical figures with the same linguistic brush that we might use in the modern moment. And so I'm like, okay, yeah, what would happen if I presented this to an audience now, especially as somebody who is transitioning? And how would that make us feel about the work that we're seeing, both in the artistic sense as well as the technical sense from a inside baseball circus snob perspective? We certainly assign certain kinds of technical value to certain kinds of movements. We expect to see certain kinds of movements from certain kinds of bodies. And I was curious how it might change perception for a viewer, if it would change perception for a viewer, if they thought that it was a woman doing a certain level of straps vocabulary, if they thought it was a man doing a certain level of straps vocabulary, if that shifted over the course of the act with costume and gender reveals, and that changed the overall perception or not. And thus began a 4-year descent into madness that did result in a finished act that did finally get into Cirque de Demain. There was many, many versions of the straps act. I think I hated all of them right up until about 6 months ago. You know, just not quite where I wanted it, but getting closer each time. It's a tall order to make an act that you feel, you know, proud enough to put out there amongst your professional peers in terms of the physical or technical level of it. And at least for me, it was more research and more work to get all of the little minute costume changes just right. All of the character research into the 4 versions of Barbette that I turned into on stage just right. The emotional world, answering all the dramaturgical questions so that it wasn't just empty spectacle. And kind of chasing my tail like that for a few years until it ended up somewhere that I didn't mind.
But were you proud of the final results, and how did you go there? Like, how was it received?
I'm proud of what I shared in Paris this past January at the Festival de Cirque Demain, Festival Mondial de Cirque Demain. Yes. I think I was probably a little too hard on myself to say that I was proud of earlier versions that preceded it in 2023. But that's what happens when, I wish I could remember who to attribute this quote to. Maybe I can look it up afterwards. But I read somewhere recently that for a lot of artists, your taste outstrips your ability. And that's a good thing. It means you're usually frustrated with your work, but the moment that your ability matches your taste is probably when you're going to start stagnating as an artist. Unfortunately, a lot of us are also perfectionists. So the dissonance between those 2 points, between your taste and your ability, can be quite upsetting for a lot of us. But, if you're going to make it as an artist, you have to get good at being uncomfortable in so many ways. That is definitely one of them, in my opinion.
I totally agree. I mean, I've always, my background is stage management and being a perfectionist myself, like the undoing of that possibility of perfection throughout a career in live performance is something that you have to learn, because there's never a perfect show, right? So, but but it doesn't stop you to strive for it, I think. And that's the thing, that you have to find comfortability in the striving for perfection and going as high as you can to that point, knowing that you did your best for that. And I've over time, it took me a long time to come to that piece, I think, in, running many shows, dealing with lots of show stops and putting on shows that I myself personally, artistically would not be proud of, but I'm working for a casino that says we're going to show this show no matter what, so it's just a weird dichotomy, an internal struggle. So I feel it. I think an artist, it's a different approach, but it's the same thing for an artist when they're doing their own creation, performance, and like you said, it's very interesting, the physicality of what is possible and what you mind wants to do as well. That's going to always be a constant battle for an artist when they're creating something.
Absolutely, yeah. I think because it took me so long to make the version of Barbette that was selected for presentation at the 44th Cirque de Demain, I have to say it was a unique experience in my career in that I felt very confident about what I was presenting. That has not been true of many other moments in my career. But in order to do justice to the legacy of Barbette, and in order to do justice to my vision of what the piece could be, it meant so much time in the artistic trenches that by the time I ended up in a place where I'm like, yep, I can present this. This is not embarrassing anymore. I was like, well, if somebody doesn't like it, it's not because I didn't do a good job. If somebody doesn't like it, that's fine. It doesn't mean that the piece does not have merit, and not in a dismissive way, not in a way to say that it doesn't matter what the audience thinks. But I think when you just spend that much time with something, it confers a certain amount of peace with the work. I don't spent that much time on a single piece of work in my career. So that was a unique experience. And I did want to give up many times along the way. And I think, Circus necessitates a faster pace of creation as well. If you're working the corporate circuit, maybe you've got your sequences or you've got a number that you change the costume to, you change the music to, fine. Or maybe somebody gets injured and drops out of a show and you're asked if you can fill in, but you got to make something that fits the bill of that show. And you're like, okay, I'll make it work. It's not the best, but I'll make it work. And as an artist, you're not satisfied, but the audience is having a great time. And so it turns into that question as well. By the time I got to the point of presenting Barbette in Paris at the end of January, I was agonizing throughout the creation process about wanting to make sure people didn't this sounds so funny to say now. I was so anxious that people not misinterpret the work. Which is like, one, you can't control that. That's a nice thought, but not possible.
I'm going to tell you all what you need to think when I perform this act.
No, I was like white knuckling, like control over some like imaginary control over an imagined narrative. And I'm like, okay, buddy, it just doesn't work that way. Early versions, part of what was so dissatisfying about earlier versions was it did feel like it was telling a story that I didn't agree with. So over the course of this act, in case you haven't seen it or you don't ever get to see it, I tried to recreate the act structure that I could find historical references of for Barbette as faithfully as possible. So I come out in this huge, I didn't have $40,000 of ostrich feathers, but my costume designer, Michael Slack, did a beautiful job recreating the same kind of silhouette. To imagine Disney's Cinderella, that's kind of the opening look with like a giant feather hat on top of it. That's the first look. That big dress comes off and reveals something that looks kind of like a 1920s flapper dress that's like covered in sequins. and I've got this jeweled cap with like blonde finger curls on it. And then that comes off, and the latest versions of the act has a very scandalous kind of one-piece bodysuit. And then that comes off, and I'm shirtless with shorts, basically. That's the final look for the final sequence of the act. And the moment where that third costume comes off, before I'm shirtless on stage, before I remove that wig on stage, depending on how I hold my posture, on how I take up space in the tent, on how I hold my face, even if you're very far away from me, like it says so much. How do I feel as an artist about being pretty naked on stage in front of you? How do I feel about taking this wig off? So many of the stories that I grew up with around recognizing or acknowledging or accepting trans identities was the born in the wrong body narrative, which of course is true for many of my trans siblings. It never was the one that resonated quite right for me, which ironically made it much more difficult for me to figure myself out. But I got there eventually. Nonetheless, if I'm on stage and I take this wig off and I'm looking at it like it's this heavy, intense, like agonizing thing, it's like, that is a story, but it's not my story, and it wasn't Barbette's story, and it's not the one that I wanted to put on stage, even if it's a narrative that people might recognize more easily. And so, yeah, that trying to like walk this fine line between how do I create a room that the audience can walk into when I perform and decide a variety of things within this room and make sure it's not the wrong room. I used to call the first versions of it like the sad boy version of the act. And now
the sad boy version.
Yeah, it should be cheeky. It should be fun. It should be playful. It should be like inviting the audience in, like with a bit of a wink, like, I got you. Aren't we having so much fun together? Like that's what I want to feel when I watch Circus. Not all Circus.
It's funny. I think a bit, whether you're trans or not, I think that, having watched all my life people walk on the stage and perform, there is something to be said about people who have done that internal struggle, that internal battle, that is certain understanding of an identity of the core of who they are, and then perform from that space as opposed to being just a performer. And when I say that there's a certain energy and an attractiveness to someone who stands there in their full glory of whoever they are and perform for people. And I often find people that are of either homosexuality or trans or have had to do that work hard and fast in their youth as they discover themselves, and they come out with such a power. And I've always quite appreciate that. And I think that's why maybe Barbette back in the day and other people who go through that were such a fascinating character, because they'd come to terms with who they are and they were putting all of that out on stage, right? And there's nothing more beautiful to watch than somebody who's comfortable in their own skin giving to an audience, I think, right? I have to go watch the video and see your performance now that you've explained this. No, because it's also got depth and breadth and history and a linkage between, like you said, the past and today. And for me, that's what art's about, is people giving their core and all of themselves on stage to make the audience feel something, right?
Mm-hmm. A friend of mine, a really wonderful aerialist named Glory Dearling, I think probably put it in the best words, so I'll just quote her instead of trying to come up with something half as good. I was I think the week after I'd gotten home from France, I was in the immediate aftershock of the festival, and telling her how people had related to the work and some of the really beautiful conversations that I had with the public after the presentations on Friday night or Saturday. And she was like, yeah, once you present that work, it's not yours anymore. She's like, it's theirs. I had so many conversations with people where I was schooling my expression into one where I'm just taking in whatever it is they felt they needed to share with me. And it was so exciting because people were like, they were so passionate about what they wanted to tell me and what they were feeling still in the, the echoes that were left after it was said and done. But, some people were like, oh, it was beautiful to see you as your authentic self in that final character on stage. And I had to like bite back a smile or a laugh and just listen and say thank you. But the final character, the male character at the end of the act, is just as much a construction as the three female characters that precedes him, and perhaps required the most work for me, the most practice, the most research, and is like an incredibly exaggerated affectation of masculinity. It was part of the reason why I did
I love
so
that.
much. I did a ton of ballet training in the last 2 years to try to make this version of my Barbette act. And that ended up being a reference point that was really useful for me in trying to hit the right tone for the male character at the end. But it's so interesting to me because I'm just me. That's certainly not how I am in daily life. But that's what somebody saw on stage. And because it was the last image they were left with, they're like, oh, well, that's got to be you. And I'm like, well, I mean, yes, like, yes, that was me on stage playing a character that I studied how to make. But they're wrong and they're not wrong. Like, I'm not, who am I to tell them that it is or isn't right? And so my friend Glory's words just really, they keep resonating for me, even now that we're about 2 months on at the time of this recording, where, yes, the work is mine. And I poured my heart and soul into it for nearly half a decade, which has been a real privilege to be able to do. It delights me in equal measure to think of the work as something that doesn't belong to me anymore. I don't think all art is like that, and I don't think all circus art is like that, but I did, this version of Barbette is, some of my peers might call it a more commercial act. It has a structure that could be worked to fit into a trad environment or a contemporary environment, and that's not necessarily the kind of work that a lot of my peers might be making in Montreal, for example. It's the one that made sense with the research that I was doing about this historical figure. And I do think that I like the idea that that kind of circus is something that you are doing for other people. Sometimes I watch circus and I feel like I'm getting permission to watch a very intimate or vulnerable moment being shared by the artist on stage, but it feels, voyeuristic is almost too strong a word, but I feel like that artist is in a private world on stage and I'm getting the opportunity to watch them for the 6 minutes that they're performing. Barbette isn't, I don't want there to be any barrier between me and whoever's watching. Like, it should feel like a big energy exchange the whole time. And people should feel different at the end of it in a way where, as a performer on stage, my energy is externally focused rather than internally focused. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so you're giving that out to the audience and you're feeding off that, I think, in terms of that exchange between audience and performer. I wanted to ask then, because you've read a lot of those books about circus and that whole box, I hope.
Yeah.
And then some, where do you think today the evolution of circus arts is headed? Because I feel like I'm currently rebuilding the House of Dancing Water over here in Macau, and nobody's spending that kind of money on a show of that scale anywhere right now. There's been some shows that have closed with Cirque on the Strip in Vegas. There's still the traditional sort of circus troupes and routes going around Europe. What's your thoughts about where circus arts is headed?
A tricky question, because which part of our global industry are we looking at? There's no way I could give any answer that's halfway complete, but to speak at least to some parts of it, from the parts of the industry that my experience has touch points on, let's put it that way. I think it's a very challenging time in the industry, but at this point in my career, I'm so resistant to the ways that I would have thought about it when I was younger, even 3 years younger or 5 years younger, which was as a little bit of a monolith, rather than seeing the different parts of the circus world that artists move in and out of, being their own unique streams that are weathering current geopolitical and economic changes in different ways. To say more what I mean, where I come from, in terms of my training background, most of my training has been in Montreal for my aerial training, which of course is the home of the Cirque du Soleil International Headquarters, as well as the National Circus School of Canada. There's a lot of the Quebec Circus School, the Provincial Circus School students that come through Montreal as well. and it's a very rich environment. People do experimental work. You have audiences who are very circus educated because the city of Montreal invests a lot of money into summer programming and festivals. If you go to school or you grow up in Montreal, seeing incredibly high level circus is just run of the mill for you, to the point that I'll talk to people in Montreal. They either have no idea that their city is this global hotspot of circus, no idea, or they have no idea that they're spoiled rotten and that is not what circus is like in many other places in the world in such high concentration. Anyways, but there has been, it seems like there's been a lot more challenges in public funding through arts councils for circus artists over the last few years. And I think that's a trend that's going to continue, whether that's operational funding for companies or individual funding for artists who are doing research grants or production grants or things like that. A lot of the landscape was supported by public arts funding, and the whole world is sliding into belt tightening mode. I remember hearing that the international festival last year in Montreal very nearly didn't happen, like almost didn't get enough funding.
Wow.
Which is, it's hard for me to wrap my brain around. It's hard to imagine making work that is not commercially successful, by which I mean making work that does not draw in audiences, does not put butts in seats, does not sell tickets, is a harder and harder feat. It's the real trick now, because if you aren't subsidizing the cost of the theater or artist salaries or technician salaries with some kind of public funding, then you can't make much of that work anymore. In an exciting way, we're starting to see kind of more grassroots, small stuff starting up. I think one of the most exciting groups that I've seen in recent times is People Watching. I think they're currently on tour in Germany, but I got to see them in Montreal, and I'm like, this is awesome. They're doing so much in a way that is both technically impressive, artistically impressive, emotionally impressive, and is working within the, let's call it, limitations of the economic limitations the industry has. They don't need a 40-foot high ceiling. They're a tight group that can travel around more easily than a 100-person outfit. And I do wonder if the creative and financial challenges that artists are facing right now will spur people to start making this kind of work more. I hope so anyways, because People Watching is incredible. On the flip side, if you're someone who was hoping to get a job with one of the big companies, this is like getting harder and harder, at least in North America, I should say. The work that I have coming up this year will largely be in Europe, and it will largely be in a more traditional context, which makes sense because a contemporary artist might describe that as a more commercial endeavor. You have to present a show that people will want to buy tickets for. There's no subsidization of that from other sources. So it's certainly going to be interesting times moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're on point on all of those points with regards to, decreases in funding. And that's not just circus, that's all of performing arts at this point.
I had a friend who works for TO Live. The name's changed a few times, but essentially it's the organization that manages like the big shows that come into Toronto's big theaters. And she was telling me how basically the bookers and the planners, like, they're going back to sure bets. So they're doing Celine Dion tributes, they're doing Swan Lake, they're not doing niche one-person shows from a playwright you haven't heard of yet because they can't take the risk because of the venue costs. I'm curious.
I can definitely speak to that. That is definitely they need to make the money, and so they'll go with a safe bet, and they'll be very risk averse with their programming, which is a shame, right? But
for that reason, I'm also interested I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
I just say, but I think that's where the industry and creatives and circus artists need to, like you said, with People Watching, need to get creative in how they present their work and how they survive. And who better to do that than creatives themselves? You've got to find a way. That's it.
Absolutely. In terms of the big companies, I think we're going to see a move away from touring and drifting towards resident shows, just because the costs are more predictable for the people above the line. And gosh, to parallel BARBETTE even, I'm curious in the darkest way possible if the political machinations of the United States, and that we're also seeing in Europe, are going to change and affect the kind of work that we see being put on stage. There's already there's already longer conversations we could have that we don't have time for about the kind of work and the kinds of artists and the kinds of bodies that we see on stage. But at least for myself, when I made Barbette, I thought of Cirque de Demain as the end of the line. And that if anything else happened after that, it would truly be gravy or a cherry on top, because regardless of how I feel about the act or think about the act, regardless of if you hear me yapping about the historical content of it, like maybe you just see it and you're like, oh, that was entertaining. I don't know what it was about, but cool. It comes across as a pretty queer act. You at least think that you're watching a weird drag act. If you don't know that I'm trans, which at this point in my transition, when I'm meeting new people, sometimes they don't. And certainly on stage, where I'm at a distance and there's stage lights, you probably can't see any surgery scars of mine. And I'm wearing a ton of makeup, which we all wear anyways. Like, it's hard to tell. And so is that kind of work going to be welcome? Whether it's a contemporary context, whether it's a traditional context, in North America, in Europe, it remains to be seen. So maybe I'll be reporting back on this in a couple of years and let you know what happened.
We should circle back in a couple of years on the podcast again, Ess, and we'll see where the world is at and where we're at.
My God.
Look, Ess, thank you so much for spending some time with us on the StageLync podcast. It's really a pleasure to get to know you and your work. I am going to go and try and read and watch some of the work that you've done that I haven't already. And best of luck for your upcoming projects.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine. There's a lot of free content on my Patreon, actually, you can check out. Don't have to sign up or subscribe or anything. So if you go there, there's plenty to read. I documented the entire research process of Barbette. So if you're morbidly curious, you can read about and even see some of the very early, terrible versions of it on there and trace it through the years. So that's all waiting for you there if you want. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Ess.
Thank you. Have yourself a great day.
Thank you for listening to the StageLync podcast. StageLync is an online platform that gives you access and connection to the live performing arts. As a guest, you can read about live performing arts from across the globe and gain insights from performers and artists on stage and all the amazing people who work behind the curtain. If you are an industry professional, StageLync Pro offers jobs, networks, and career support tools, and you can build your own professional profile on the site. As a StageLync podcast listener, you are eligible for 20% off your StageLync Pro membership. Visit us at stagelync.com, and when joining, use the code SLPodcast. StageLync, that's Stagelync.com.